We return to the Northern Theater in this lesson. The last time we looked at the Northern Theater, General Howe had captured Philadelphia in late 1777, but he had also failed to support General Burgoyne of Quebec, leading to the surrender at Saratoga. It was kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, they captured the capital at Philadelphia. On the other hand, they lost 6,000 troops to surrender. Howe moved into Philadelphia, and it immediately became clear to him that he had failed and that Parliament would be sending for him. He would have to return to London, and there he would have to legally defend his actions of the war. So he holed up in Philadelphia, and the winter passed for him and also for the British troops. They were warm, they were generally well fed. That was not the case for Washington. Washington led his men to a place called Valley Forge. Now, surprisingly, it was only about 20 miles from Philadelphia, certainly within striking distance for General Howe. But Howe had remembered Bunker Hill, and he was under no belief that he would be able to take Valley Forge. So there, Washington and his men holed up for the winter. Now, it wasn't a particularly brutal winter, and that's good, because the Continental Army may not have been able to survive a brutal winter. But it was nevertheless too cold, and supplies were too short. Now, Valley Forge was simply exactly what it sounds like. It was a valley in between two hilly regions, and there had been a large forge in that valley. It had been destroyed by the British whenever they had conquered Philadelphia. Washington moved his soldiers into that region because he found it to be defensible, and it also had a fresh water supply. Although the village had been destroyed, there was all kinds of lumber, and his men immediately set to the task of felling trees and building small log huts. General Washington stayed in a tent until all of his men were able to move into the huts, and then he rented a small home that he would use as his main area of work. They also went and created defense lines and fences and ditches and prepared just in case the British came out of Philadelphia, but they never did. And although the hardships would follow, Washington remained calm and caring. His presence helped his men cope and look for a brighter day. One French observer who came to camp said, "Soon I came in sight of the camp. My imagination had pictured an army with uniforms and the glitter of arms and standards, etc. In short, a military pomp of all sorts. And instead of the imposing spectacle I expected, I saw grouped together or standing alone a few militiamen, poorly clad and for the most part without shoes, many of them badly armed." He wasn't mistaken. Most of the people at Valley Forge, most of the soldiers, were poorly equipped, and many of them didn't have shoes. There's even stories of bloody footprints in the snow, and of course, amputations because of frostbite. Food was in short supply. Some days, the men just had flour and water. And although water came from nearby streams, both animal and human waste was dumped in those streams, and so the men became sick with disease and dysentery and typhus, pneumonia, and smallpox. 12,000 soldiers were in Valley Forge at the beginning. Over 2,000 of these would die of disease, and about another 1,000 would desert. In fact, Washington, in order to curb desertion, had to discipline the men, including hanging some for the crime. A military hospital was built at Valley Forge, and in fact, many of the sick people were removed from the main camp and allowed to recover in different places. But that military hospital was also short of supplies. There were simply too many sick. The sick were distributed in many different communities around Valley Forge, in barns, in churches, in meeting houses, and dwellings in the area. And in this way, they were slowly able to recover. There was also a large group of women who came to Valley Forge and helped. And they did a lot of the cooking, and they were also paid to do laundry. This kept disease down. Martha Washington famously arrived in camp in early February, just before George Washington's birthday. She kept in charge of the general's quarters and also his staff, and maintained civility with everyone. She took also over the organization of the laundry and the cooking, and she even put on a small play for the officers. Many other soldiers' families arrived, the wives and the children living in that camp, washing, mending, cooking, working as nurses. There were also slaves and even some Native Americans present in the camp as well. Those first 3 months were terrible, but in February and March, things began to improve. First, some visitors from Congress arrived in the camp in January to view the misery themselves. They had been receiving letters from Washington. Now they came to observe it, and they were shocked. They immediately reacted by working towards provisioning the army. There was also a German baron who arrived, Baron von Steuben. Now, he was a proven Prussian drill master. He set about immediately teaching the men daily how to march, how to form lines, how to use a bayonet, how to discern and hear and follow orders. He even had the officers drilling with the men, and in a matter of months, that ragtag bunch of colonial militiamen had turned into a prideful, well-moving army. Nathaniel Greene was promoted to the quartermaster of the entire army, a job for which he was very well suited. He was responsible for securing provisions and supplies and equipment, and he immediately set to the task, improving the roads around Valley Forge and the bridges so that more and more carts and things like this could come to the valley and supply the army. And there was also a baking company from Philadelphia that left the city of Philadelphia, moved out to the camp. It was led by a baker named Christopher Ludwig, and he brought with him 70 other men who all they did was make bread daily for the troops. And also, the weather began to improve, and locals began setting up farmer markets and selling goods to the camp. In April, the men learned that France had entered the war, and they celebrated. My main point is this. Valley Forge was a crucible. The men arrived, broken, undisciplined, poorly provisioned, with more losses than they had victories. But over those 6 months, they trained, they figured out exactly what they wanted, and they believed in their commander-in-chief. And they left that crucible rebranded, in high spirits, disciplined, and fit.